And I can confirm that we're live. And that's not what I wanted to be sharing. So I'm going to stop sharing now because there's too many people coming in as we get started. The YouTube feed is running. We're about a minute away from 4 o'clock, and I think we just got more of our members. And Pastor Smith, I'll tell you when it's 4. Well, my clock just said 4, so anytime you'd like to start the meeting.
Okay, we're going to get started then. Good afternoon and welcome to the quarterly meeting of the Half-Cent Oversight Committee. We are meeting via Zoom as we're in the midst of our pandemic. And I want to officially call this meeting to order. I would ask the audience to assist us by muting yourselves so that we don't have multiple background noises. And if you would like to speak on a particular subject matter, you can either use the raise hand or clap your thumbs up feature on Zoom or wave your hand at us, and we will recognize you and ask you to unmute at that time. We begin the meeting today with the approval of the minutes. Brian Moore is here to assist us. Here's our agenda for today. We'll have the approval of the minutes from our March 2nd meeting. And then we begin this meeting with a general discussion that will be followed by the facilities updates from district staff, the financial information to include some indication of the financial impact because of what we're experiencing at this time, and then a discussion around scheduling our next meeting, as we may need to make an adjustment. So with that, the minutes are on the screen for your review. And after review, I will accept a motion for the acceptance of the minutes.
Mr. Chair, I don't mean to rush anybody, but having read these, I'll just submit a motion to accept.
We have a motion to accept. Is there a second?
I will second.
We have a motion and it's been seconded, properly second. All in favor, let it be known by sign of aye.
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 Opposers have the same privilege. Minutes stand approved. We begin then with a general discussion, board today or committee today, as there has been some developments that have come to our attention that we thought it was important for us to address. And so the staff has prepared a facilities update. And if you had the chance to look at this 27-page PowerPoint, you can see that there are a number of issues raised that are listed on page 2 of that handout. It was sent out by the district's office this morning in hopes that all of you have had a chance to review it. And so there are some concerns that have been raised regarding the most recent land contract that was entered into that we wanted to have a chance to discuss with the committee today and with staff so that we can make certain that we're moving in the right direction and that our actions are consistent with the ballot language, so we don't breach the public trust as it relates to what this committee has been asked to do and effectively do that with the support and cooperation of the staff. So with that, I'd open it up for any questions regarding the most recent land acquisition.
Mr. Chair, I had had a question relative to what was the plan from staff to run through this entire presentation?
Mr. Scarborough, yes, that was the intention. Once some of the concerns came, I asked staff to pull together some information, at least for the concerns that we had been made aware of, to try to answer some of those concerns as brief a method as possible, obviously. And so hence why that information was sent on Friday, and then obviously some updated data today. So staff is prepared to do that because there are certainly some talking points within the presentation that may be helpful for the committee to hear, but I will leave that to the committee.
And this is the chair speaking. I think there are a couple of things. One is that I've had a chance to share my concerns with both Superintendent Clark and Assistant Superintendent White. And I shared those at the board meeting on this past Tuesday. My first concern is that we must insist that we honor the process that has been established, that we went to the public and asked for their support of this sales tax with an understanding that there would be an oversight committee that would play a critical role in how these funds are expended. And we did not do this with this particular acquisition, this particular matter. And as the chair, it's troubling to me because I want this committee to be afforded the chance to do what it is being commissioned to do. It's further troubling to me because we need the school board to make certain that when these decisions are brought to them, that one of the questions that they would ask is, has this been reviewed by the oversight committee? It's a check and balance for us to make certain that we're doing things the right way. And so that did not occur with this. And I raised the concern because I don't think the ballot language gives us the right to decide that this should be treated as an exception because we're negotiating, what have you. It may require us to have a call meeting or make some other arrangements, but I think we must insist that we honor the process and we do the right things the right way. So that would be a concern that I would put out there, given the timeline where these negotiations have been going on for some time, and we've met at least twice since these negotiations have been done. So that's where I want to launch my initial concern about what has occurred here. I want to be able to advocate for the schools, the actions that were taken. And when we're not properly involved, I was in a discussion with someone and disputed them that this was going on because we had just had our previous meeting and it had not been shared, only to find out that something differently had occurred. So that's the first thing I want to make clear. Let's just have a group of people that we use when we want to, as opposed to a process that honors what people feel they voted for and that we want to make sure that we're adhering to.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, along those same lines, it was, obviously a well-run campaign, in my opinion, to get this passed. And I was fortunate enough to be in lots of rooms, sometimes filled with people who weren't terribly excited over this notion. And unfortunately, I first came to know of this purchase when I read about it in the newspaper. Just as unfortunately, some of those who I believe voted for the half cent, they at least told me they did afterwards, but they were hard to persuade. And what I think persuaded them was that there was a list of projects that was, very clear. And furthermore, the assurance that there would be an oversight committee, and my big mouth saying that, and if it did pass, I would be willing to serve on the oversight committee. And so when that didn't occurred this way. And Pastor Smith, just one item of correction, just based on the PowerPoint, it looks like staff at least was aware that this might come back around as being available back on July the 9th of 19. We've met 3 times since then. And so when it didn't come up, to me, that didn't feel great as someone who had kind of pledged that we'd pay attention and be good stewards of the public funds. But it also occurred to me, and we've been meeting for just a year. I believe last June was our first meeting. But this is the second time this has happened. The last time it happened was when I was sitting in a friend's driveway Halloween night when I first heard about Westwood being a swing school for Howard Bishop, and not having a lot of information about that conversation was also somewhat embarrassing, frankly. And so my hope is that at the end of this, we come to an agreement as to the purpose of this body, and furthermore, that we will be used to that purpose and be read in earlier on when these kind of things come up. So I'll reserve other comments for later.
Pastor Smith, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would it be helpful if I put up what the board adopted in terms of the Oversight Committee's kind of functions? Share that screen.
If you would first put up the ballot language, which is page 3, just to remind us of what we said to the citizen, and then follow that with your document.
Okay. Let me get
So it's
that.
page 3 in the staff's presentation for today, because it speaks to new construction, land acquisition and improvement, which has been somewhat of a misunderstanding as we've gone through that. I know one of the callers in the school board meeting last week indicated that they didn't realize it included that, but it anchors this with what we just talked about, with oversight by an independent citizens committee. And oversight should be interpreted as before decision, not after decision. Okay, Brian, you want to go forward?
So I can't remember if I'm muted.
You're live.
Okay, sorry. So this is what the board adopted back in December of 2018, where it talks about the responsibilities of the Oversight Committee shall be to A, elect a chair and vice chair, B, establish a meeting schedule, C, review the expenditures of revenues from the surtax and ask for more information pertaining to the expenditures if needed, provide a written report to the superintendent and board regarding the expenditure of revenues on an annual basis, and report to the superintendent and board chairman in a timely fashion any inconsistencies between the ballot language and the actual expenditure of surtax revenues. And I can't speak to the One Mill Oversight Committee formulation. I was not here in 2008, but this largely mirrors the same setup that the One Mill Oversight Committee has. And so I think we've been following kind of the same pattern with that, as opposed to having staff come up with ideas that then go through a committee before they're acted on. And we get to the PowerPoint. I don't want to take up time here. I'm sorry. But when we get to the PowerPoint, there is talk about the statute and the confidentiality of negotiations and the difficulty that might come up with at a public meeting discussing a potential land acquisition. But I don't want to dominate the committee's time. I just wanted to know if you wanted to share. This is what the board adopted, so this might be what you would need to seek to have changed if you'd like it to be done differently.
Thank you, Brian.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if just in the interest of brevity, let me just say that I share with Brian his frustration and kind of feeling of something isn't quite as it should be, and also with yours, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
are you done, Jason? This is Karen Alford. I also concur with the comments that have been made. I think there were several opportunities for the folks in charge, the administrators, to come to the committee. If nothing else, if you didn't have all the details, at least with the heads up. I only found out about it as I looked over the agenda for the regular board meeting, and I was sort of thrown aback by this agenda item as a board member, not having heard a thing about it. So I definitely think it needs to be addressed. The transparency part of the whole initiative of the half-cent was big on people's mind. They did not want another tax, but the fact that there would be citizen input and oversight, I think that was a vote yes because of the needs of our school. So if that's not the process we're going to follow, I think we need to sit down and regroup on this whole idea of oversight committee. I know that all of our times are valuable and we have several things that we support in this community. So we're not in this just to be a namesake oversight committee. We do desire to have the input and to have a say in those decisions so that we're representing what our citizens want for our community and for our schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alford.
Mr. Chair, this is Carrie Bush, if I may.
Carrie, please go ahead.
I'll just say I am generally in a similar position as I've heard the other members. I read about it in the paper as well. What I'm interested in hearing, and it's probably what's going to be discussed in the PowerPoint, I'd really like to understand what is the status of the land acquisition. Are there points in the process in which, if this committee felt that this was not an appropriate use, is that even still a potential to weigh in on with that kind of opinion? So number one, what is the status of the land acquisition? I'm very interested to know. And I'd also be interested to hear, if staff feels that there was a breakdown in the process and the communication, or if this is how they envision it should have gone. Those would be my two questions.
And staff is on and will be prepared, but we wanted to give everyone to respond. We want to give everyone a chance to express their questions and our concerns. Are there others?
Mr. Chair, I've got a couple of comments, that's all.
Go right ahead, Tom.
Well, I very much concur with the other members, especially Brian Scarborough. I'm not about finding out about this in the street and on the paper. I'd like to hear it directly from the schools. And maybe as a possible solution or part of a solution going forward, this committee could get maybe bi-weekly updates and communications, or maybe monthly, whatever. But, we were totally out of the loop on a lot of this, and we should be in the loop on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. I have my hand up.
Okay, this is
Karen McCann.
okay. Karen, come right ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. So I think the problem was the breakdown in communication. There's no question about that, we were all kind of hit with this and it was in the newspaper and we're on the committee and we didn't know about it. So that was a problem. But when Brian read the description of our task, it doesn't sound like the committee makes decisions on how the money is being spent. It makes decisions on whether the money is being spent appropriately and oversight to make sure that everything is done upfront and legal. I think we could have had a discussion, or we should have had a discussion about it. The acquisition of the property, the cost of the property, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think our role is to make those final decisions as to, I think we should have had input and we should have been allowed to share how we felt about it. But from the description, the 5 things that Brian read, it doesn't sound like the committee actually has the final decision, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I think the real breakdown really occurred when I didn't know, or none of us knew that this was occurring. And I would hope we have better communication in the future. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Karen. Are there others on this?
I'd like to weigh in also,
No.
Mr. Chair, if I can.
Somebody
And
ahead.
Mr. Van also has his hand up, just for, just.
Okay. Thank you. Somebody ahead, Dean.
Yeah, I'd like to echo a lot of what Brian, Tom, Jason, and Karen said as well. I mean, I think there is definitely a disconnect here, and whether or not our role is a proactive review in terms of oversight, which I think, at least someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think everyone sitting here who is a citizen taking part in this oversight committee believes we were to have a proactive role and to review decisions prior to them being made. So there's a very large distinction between having no input whatsoever, between having the opportunity at least to weigh in, and then the alternative, which is decisions are made, and then all of a sudden it's our job to simply say, well, that was a bad decision, or that was a great decision. So that's a major distinction. And oversight, in my view, is the opportunity to review data, review information, and review decisions prior to them being executed. And I do reject some of the arguments I've heard being made with respect to, you can't have an effective negotiation if it's, in the public purview. I get it. I handle negotiations every single day as the course of my profession. There are ways to manage this and partition this in a way that both protects the integrity of any negotiation that's ongoing, as well as to get proper input from all of the people involved. So this is a big deal. And I think this is not just a big deal with respect to the two decisions Brian brought up, being the transition of Howard Bishop to Westwood and also this land acquisition, but also moving forward. I mean, is this committee going to have the opportunity to look at data, to weigh in, to be briefed, and to help make decisions? Or is our role simply to sit by passively? Decisions are made, and then we simply weigh in at the end of the year in our annual report as to whether we liked or did not like those decisions. And I think I need clarity on that issue. And if I've heard the other folks in this meeting as well, I think we all need clarity on that issue.
Thank you.
This is Sue Legg. I'd like to make a comment.
There was someone, Brian, that you mentioned before, Sue, that we need to bring in.
Stephen Van had his hand up for a while.
Okay, Steve, will you come in, and then we'll get Sue immediately after that.
Sure. Dean pretty much said everything that I was going to say. Oversight is a big word, and I don't think the way this process went through allowed us that ability to do oversight. I agree with them that you can retain proprietary information and stuff and still give us good information about what's going on and let us weigh in, and if we believe that it's the way that the intent of the legislation and what the voters wanted. And really we all want the same goal. We want the best school system in the state, one of the best in the country, and we know infrastructure is the basis for that. But that for us to help the school board get there and for the staff to get there, we have to be able to trust them. And this just really, it set a low level of trust at the beginning. So I'd like to see us sort of implement some type of process or policy to make it give us more informed and let us be able to perform our oversight. That's all.
Okay. Are you ready for me?
Yes, Sue.
Okay, 2 points on this. One is we were given a project list, and land acquisition was not on that list of projected projects. So if we had known that we were in the process of looking for land wherever we were in the process of looking for it ahead of time, we wouldn't have had to be involved in the negotiation over a specific piece. We would have at least known it was on the list. The second thing that I wanted to say was that going forward, one of the things that I've been concerned about is how do we measure our progress? In other words, where are we on our time frame? We should know in regular intervals, are we on schedule or are we not on schedule? And we have no way of getting that information now. The way the data comes to us, it's in a spreadsheet form saying this is how much we spent. But if we have a particular set of priorities, then we should know at what point we are, say in December, on our list of projected priorities. So we need that process, which leads me to the comment that whoever wrote that mission for the Oversight Committee needs to be brought back and have new wording proposed that allows us to at least know what's planned in general terms so that we can provide the feedback and that whether or not what is planned is actually happening. I mean, supposing we decided that there wasn't enough money to do a particular school, would we find out about that afterwards? Or would we find out about it before the decision was made? That's the kind of process that would make me feel more comfortable.
Thank you, Sue. Excellent points. And I think the message that the committee wants both the school administration and the board to hear is that we want to help you gain win-win outcomes that are valued and appreciated by all. And that while we don't have authority for approval, if we are a sounding board or a reflection of the community, at least that's considered in the decision making. And for me, one thing I would ask the school board, before you approve any request of this nature, that you would ask the question, has this been subject to review by the Oversight Committee? Just ask the question. And if not, I would urge you not to vote on it, because that's the public trust that we've been talking about. And then secondly, as many have expressed, there are ways to communicate critical confidential issues that allows people who've been put in positions to aid you to be a voice of information without violating the confidentiality. And we've got to make sure we seize both of those. And with that, district staff, I want to turn it over for the facilities update in an overview kind of way, Karen and team, so that it's meaningful, but so that it's meaningful to all concerned.
Sure, thank you, Pastor Carl. Brian is sharing, or should be sharing the screen. My screen doesn't look like yours at the moment. Let me try to get it so I can make sure I'm seeing exactly what you're seeing there. Following listening to concerns, I asked staff to pull together an update. This is the same presentation that we will be presenting to the board at their workshop this coming Wednesday at 2 o'clock, because there were several concerns that were raised. And so we wanted to make sure that we address some of those, but also to give you kind of an update on where we have come this year with different projects, some major projects, some of the minor maintenance projects we've talked about, because part of the tax was also to get back on a regular maintenance schedule. So we've got, and you've seen this if you had a chance to review, a lot of information there, but then some things, some talking points even moving forward, because at the end of the day, I will take ownership of all of that, regardless of what staff did or did not do. I, as the leader of the organization, have to be able to do that. And as we work through this, we want to make sure that we do maintain that trust. And at this point, obviously, we have to work to rebuild that trust. I'm not naive to think we don't have to work to rebuild that. Because at the end of the day, I don't remember who exactly mentioned it. I think it was Pastor Carl, that we do want what's best for our schools and the students in our community. And obviously making these facilities improvements and new buildings and knocking down old ones and all these renovations and things are key to that for our students. And so you have my commitment that that's what we're going to be doing moving forward. But I wanted staff to have the opportunity to go through this with you all briefly. I know there's lots of other things on the agenda, but I wanted to give staff the opportunity to go through some of these things. And so I will turn it over to Jackie Johnson to kind of go through some of this with you, and then some other staff will plug in at various points.
Jackie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pastor Carl. Yes, there were obviously a number of issues have been raised since the school board voted on the purchase in early May, and some of those you have talked about, some not yet, including the fact that the land acquisition and new construction was not emphasized during the half-cent campaign, that the purchase of the property and the construction of new elementary school that all of that is happening before projects at existing schools are underway. There have been concerns that the cost of the property is too high, questioning of some of the appraisals and the realtors, concerns that there was not enough public discussion of the purchase, and that certainly includes discussion with the half-cent oversight committee, because of course you all operate in the sunshine. And then the concerns about the purchase of property during the COVID-19 pandemic. You did already talk about the ballot language, and yes, certainly land acquisition and improvement was part of the ballot language. I included a slide that was part of the presentation that I gave probably 40, 50 times in the lead up to the vote. And we talked about our 3 key goals: modernizing our existing facilities, getting back on track with maintenance, because of course, due to a lack of funding, we had not been able to keep up with maintenance in our schools. And as you all know, when you don't do that, you end up with more extensive and more expensive problems. But I also talked about capacity, the need to build new spaces, eliminate portables. In the same presentation, I had discussions about how many portables we have, how many students are in portables, how many of our schools are overcrowded. But I also talked about the fact that we're not just talking about classroom spaces and adding classroom spaces to existing schools. And one of the prime examples I talked about was the lack of core facilities or appropriate core facilities, things like media centers and cafeterias. And I talked frequently about the fact that we have at many of our schools having students starting lunch before 10 o'clock, sometimes even at 9:30, because the core capacity is not big enough. So that was something that we frequently raised during the presentations. The issue of has been raised that no, all of this is happening before any work is being done at the existing schools. And of course, I think that is built on the faulty assumption that if you don't see walls going up and you don't see dirt being turned, that means nothing is happening, which of course I'm sure you all recognize is absolutely not the case. There is so much work that has to happen behind the scenes before all of those kinds of steps are taken. So for example, Howard Bishop Middle School, our target completion date for Howard Bishop Middle School's complete renovation, really reconstruction, because we're knocking down a majority of the buildings at that school and building new ones. That is targeted completion fall of 2021. The design plans are complete. Demolition will begin in mid-July, and in fact, we tentatively have a demolition celebration scheduled for July 14th. The transition school is well under construction, as you will see if you've driven by 34th Street by the Westwood campus anytime recently. And the move out of the existing buildings is already occurring at Howard Bishop. We do have obviously design plans for the school. Our original plan was to present these at a big community meeting at the school. Unfortunately, COVID-19 blew those plans out of the water. So we are now working with the architect to put together a video that will allow the architect to explain in more detail what is planned with this project, what this design plan will mean, what the elevations will look like. And then of course, we will be sharing that with the larger Howard Bishop community. And we plan to do the same thing for Idlewild and Metcalf as well.
Jackie, this is Pastor Smith. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
And I think this came up a couple of times in our beginning discussion. Where are we against our plan? Is this on track? Is it three months ahead of schedule, 2 months behind schedule? And again, staff, if that could be some routine information you provide every presentation, I think that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. And a little later on in the presentation, we're going to show you what we have on our website, which includes a dashboard that shows where we are in terms of both the budget and the schedule, but I'll share more information when we get to that portion of the presentation.
Hey, Jackie,
Yes.
you said that that video is going to be shared with the school's community. Can we just change that to shared with the entire community?
Oh, well, absolutely. Yes. What we will be doing is pushing it out directly to the staff, the families, the neighborhoods. We have all the people that attended the community meetings that we had at the school. We have their emails and names. We'll push it out to them. But of course, we'll also post on our website, Facebook, Twitter. So certainly anybody who has interest in this, we will definitely be pushing that out to everyone. Metcalf Elementary School, also targeted for completion in fall of 2021. Like Bishop and like Idlewild, we're planning on knocking down a majority of the buildings at that school, building new ones. The design plans are nearly complete. The construction of the new buildings will begin this summer. We are fortunate the students will not need to move off campus. We have enough space on that campus where they will actually be able to remain in buildings on the campus while the new buildings are under construction. Idlewild Elementary School, also targeted for completion, fall of 2021. The design plans for Idlewild are 60% complete. The demolition and construction begins there this summer. The renovations of the Prairie View Transition School, that's of course where the kids will be staying, housed while their school is under construction. And that is nearly complete. They're actually putting on the final touches. And actually, I got some pictures today. The moving trucks are there today at Idlewild. They've already packed up everything at the school and they start delivering it to and unloading it at Prairie View tomorrow morning. Construction and capacity projects. The design plans for Elementary School I are complete. Construction is scheduled to begin in the summer of 2020. And again, as with Howard Bishop and Idlewild and Metcalf, the target completion is in the fall of 2021. The design plans for I were based largely on the designs that we used at Meadowbrook Elementary School. And that was obviously a way to save both time and money to get to do it that way. And we've started the selection process for design professional for the new 15 classroom building at Oakview Middle School. And one of the things I do want to address is the project plan, which you can see that this was the project plan that we talked about. Elementary School I was certainly listed in that plan, as was site acquisition was actually listed in that plan that we shared with the public. It was also, the ballot language, of course, was included in all of the publications that the district sent out to the community. Renovations and remodeling, the design.
Jackie, can I interject for just a second?
Sure.
Brian, would you mind going back one slide for I? Thank you. Part of elementary I, we had approved, I guess back in October, if I recall correctly, the construction manager for that project, and the first big release, or I guess that's the right term to use, for I is actually coming up tomorrow. It's already an approved scenario, but in order to start on the site work, so they could get started on that following board approval, that will be actually on tomorrow night's board agenda to approve, so they can go ahead and get, and Paul may be able to speak a little clearer to that than I can, but looking at the materials they need and to start the site work there at I guess, because there's an 8 to 12 week window in there where they can do this work before the actual materials come in for the construction. So that's coming, and we are on schedule for that. Sorry, Jackie.
Sure. Again, so the design work for the renovation of both the Santa Fe and the East Side High School's auditorium is underway, and actually some preliminary improvements have already been completed at Santa Fe, for example, the replacement of the flooring. And the remodeling of a space inside Kanapaha Middle School to actually create more classroom space, that was completed a few months ago. HVAC and roof replacements. This was something we talked about an awful lot in the lead up to the election. And I want to make it clear that what I'm talking about here, we're not talking about patching roofs, and we're not talking about repairing HVAC units. We are talking about full-blown replacement, and that has been completed at all of the schools that you see listed on both of these two slides, and it's underway at this point at the schools you see listed on the screen. And of course, we are adding more all the time. And this was a big issue for us leading up to the campaign, or during the campaign, excuse me. Security upgrades. We also talked about this during the campaign, and it's on the ballot language. We've completed a number of security related projects, primarily fencing and security gates like the ones you see here on the screen. This is Alachua Elementary. Alachua, like a lot of our schools, was built long before anybody worried about on-campus intruders and school shootings and things like that. And the layout is, it makes security tougher. So that's why we have done a lot of this work at existing schools. And then these are more recently completed schools. We've also got the installation starting this summer on new door locks in all classrooms at all schools, except those that are obviously undergoing major reconstruction projects. Maintenance. We are getting back on our regular maintenance schedule. That includes HVAC, energy upgrades and repairs at the schools you see listed, flooring, the schools you see listed there. And of course, more of those projects are being added all the time. Every school was allocated $50,000 to spend on some sort of facilities related improvement. Those projects have to be approved by the school advisory council at each school. Some of them have to be approved by our district-wide building committee to make sure that they don't conflict with any future plans. So schools have put in playgrounds, purchased furniture, installed digital marquees, bleachers, sensory paths, a lot of other items. What we did do was group some projects to try to save money. So we tried to purchase marquees all at the same time and playground equipment all at the same time. So you can see the playground that went up at Rawlings, and this is some new furniture in the cafeteria at Newberry High School. Property improvements. We have made some improvements in the property between Lincoln Middle School and Williams. That was a very wet area, and that was a cooperative project with Wild Spaces and Public Places. The parking lot reconstruction at Stephen Foster Elementary School is complete, and the construction is underway for the redesign of the Wiles Elementary School parking lot. Land acquisition, and of course, Brian will be talking a little bit more about that. The district will be closing this week on the property in Jonesville, and Brian will share with you more about the timeline for that particular acquisition. The district is also evaluating the purchase of property next to Gainesville High School. And Brian, if you could head to the next slide. Gainesville High School is slated for a massive reconstruction project, which will include the demolition of all of those buildings that Brian is circling there, and probably some others, and those house thousands of students. And as you can see, the property is pretty landlocked. Many of you have probably on 13th Street driven by that office building that was vacant for a long time and then being worked on and so on and so forth. We got word that there was going to be a possibility that that might be available, which would be very useful as we are reconstructing GHS. So the district is exploring that possibility at this point.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask a question. Jackie, specific to that GHS purchase, what's the time frame on that as far as it being evaluated, and what's that process look like?
I would have to defer to Paul and his staff on that. They will have a little bit more information on that for you.
Paul and staff, are you available?
And I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can bring us back out to the group. I don't see, there's Paul.
Yeah, Paul's on somewhere.
Okay, there he is.
There he is.
Paul, did you hear the question?
Paul's muted or something.
Is that better?
Sorry, I did a mute all. So Paul, you're freezing up.
Better?
Your video is
Okay.
frozen, but go, I'm going to stop talking. Well, I think you're going, I think it's all right now.
My mute is not on. I'm not sure what's going on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we've had a preliminary assessment of the property. We're going to need to have the building analyzed by structural engineer and appraisals. We need to look at what the implications of the code are, determine whether we can use the existing building or whether we would be better to tear it down. So that's where we are in the process. We have not made any kind of tentative offer with the property, although they're anxious to sell. But that's where we are. We have some our due diligence before we could bring a package to the superintendent to consider, or either say we've looked at it and it's not worth the effort. I would say though that, as Jackie mentioned, we're going to need another site. This is right next door, so we'd like to make it work if possible. The location means the pricing is going to be significantly different. Property we keep you updated as we move forward on that process.
Are there other questions and concerns, committee, that you'd like to raise as we're at this point in the overview by Jackie?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I just want to drill down on my former question. So I understand it's ongoing. Is this a 60-day window, 180-day window? Talk to me on days as far as timeline. Are we going to see something if we meet again in a quarter? Do we need to think about getting back together in 30 days? What's projection as far as all of those structural engineering and appraisals and all that stuff?
I would estimate a 60-day window to get all the analysis done that we need to. So, but we can provide monthly, and I think we'll talk about that as we talk about moving forward. That's later in the presentation in terms of our communication strategy with the committee. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I wrote down 60 days, so we'll talk about meeting schedules later.
And I think we can try to maybe summarize what Paul was saying for those of you that lost the audio there, since his connection's really poor right now, but we can send out more detail afterwards, so we don't have to decipher some of that. Paul, I went ahead and muted you because it's really sketchy where you are in terms of your connection.
Mr. Chair, I did have a question. If you were asking about other slides, or if you want to let Jackie get to the slide, it's about 3 ahead where my next questions were. However you want to proceed.
Why don't you go ahead, because I'm going to try to get Jackie to speed up a little bit.
Okay.
Well, actually, could I just interrupt? This is my last slide, and then Alex takes over. So, Brian, your question would probably be directed to Alex as opposed to me. Great.
Alex, I was not at the last meeting, but my wife was, so we were represented. There was a note on Oakview in the handouts from the last meeting where the project cost was shown to be about $5,873,024. And on the slide there, it's 8.9 and change. I was just wondering about the delta, and perhaps we were talking about a wider scope now.
Right, so I don't think the scope has changed necessarily, and if there's someone from facilities that wants to jump in here, feel free to do that. But I think what happened was we got a little bit better data in terms of what the construction costs are at this moment. When we went through the process with and some of the other big projects. And I think we've updated that based on what we're seeing at a cost per square foot kind of basis.
So I'm sorry. So we were off by a factor of greater than 50%.
I'd really have to defer to facilities on those kind of questions. I'm not involved necessarily with the development of those figures, but that's my understanding is we've updated it based on the actual square foot costs we're seeing. I think
We have some more
specifically
due diligence
high for
before
new
we can-
construction.
Okay, digging back on this same slide, maybe we can put a pin in that and get a little more info on it. But it did look like, as compared to 3 months ago, the transition school project cost was down about 600 grand, and so that came in a little lower.
Yeah, honestly, right now, and just for the committee in general, you know, obviously we've been working on projections for probably going on 3 years at this point. We're just now starting to get some actual GMP, some actual data, and we're updating these figures as we go along. And obviously, just in terms of this project list, I can tell you these numbers are changing daily. In most instances, they're changing in a good way, where we're getting, you know, some really competitive rates or in terms of construction costs on elementary school I, and I think that came in, I want to say $3 or $4 million less than we thought it would. So a lot of those budgetary figures as we move along, you know, we sharpen the pencil, we work with the contractors to, you know, modify the scope or whatever we need to do to stay within budget. But what we're seeing in most instances is our actual costs are less than we projected, just based on the fact that, you know, when you go through 30% design, 60 and 90, until you get kind of to the end, it's really difficult for a construction contractor. There's too much uncertainty. So just like it would be the stock market or interest rates, more uncertainty, you know, you have to build a buffer in there. So as we kind of get closer with those designs to being complete, we're seeing those costs go down, which of course is really good.
Alex, this is Suzanne. Could I jump in for a minute?
Please.
Hi, this is Suzanne Wynn. I'm the Director of Planning and Construction. My title is Community Planning, but I'm basically working with my team of 7 others to accomplish these projects. So just speaking to elementary school I, our GMP, we're finishing up, putting the finishing touches on that. That's going to be coming to our June 16th board meeting. We have the early release package coming to the June 2nd. The total package is coming to the June 16th meeting. Our GMP came in at 1.3 million less than we were projecting. Overall project costs are about 3.1 million less than what we projected in our overall project list. So that's very positive. The Oakview Middle School, what we did there, what I did there was when we were going into the bonding process, I recalculated the estimated square feet for that building based on what's existing at Kanapaha. We think we can get creative with design and get rid of some of the excess space. So that's one thing. We've just received proposals from architects for this project. So we have to go through the review committee process, the shortlisting, the interviews, the ranking, and the selection before we even get into design. And then the other thing I did was apply the current square foot cost that we were getting with elementary school I when we were at 60% before we bid. So this number is, in my opinion, is on the high end, but we wanted to be conservative for the bonding process. If we do not use all these monies for these particular projects, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, this is your area of expertise, we can apply these monies that have been bonded to other projects on our list. The other thing that's different about Oakview Middle School, especially in this environment, is this is not going to be a GM, a construction manager. This is going to be bid. So I think that's also going to be in our favor.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Right, and thank you, Alex and Suzanne and Brian and others. Here's an example where I think some type of progress against plan report, I think this is what Sue was mentioning, would be helpful. We planned 30 million, we're tracking for 27 million. We planned 5 million, we're tracking for 8 million. With a brief explanation would just be helpful to speak to where we are, because we know that it's a changing picture, but without that explanation, it looks like we missed it by a whole lot, only with some additional information to find that preliminarily, but it looks like these things are going to work in our favor. So, and I know I've asked a couple of times if we could have some type of plan versus actual reporting on these projects. Here's what we plan to spend. Here's what we're now actually projecting given these factors. I think it will be very helpful for this committee to be able to assist. Alex, I think she passed the ball to you.
Actually, I have one more quick slide to present if I could.
Okay.
One of the questions was asked, and Brian, I don't know if I have access, if you could click when it's appropriate. This is our facilities update page. And yeah, Brian, scroll down a little bit more to project update summary. Go back to that, right. And in the middle of the page in purple on the left-hand side.
Hold on, I'm going to go directly to the page instead of
Okay.
trying to share the PowerPoint.
Okay. It should be a hot link, but. So this is our facilities update page, and you can see project update summary in blue. Brian, click on that. That will look a lot like, and we keep updating that. That looks a lot like what I presented today. And now, Brian, if you'll go back, we also have our story map. This allows people to go school by school and see what projects are planned, timelines, and where we are. So Brian, if you would go to middle schools, go to Bishop. And you can see what is planned for Bishop. You can see the project, but also Brian, if you'll go to project progress reports in the middle, this is the dashboard that we have come up with that tells you what has been completed, what has been spent, what has been encumbered. It tells you where we are in terms of scheduling. So for example, you can see that we are 100% finished with the planning, design, and permitting for that particular project. And we have this kind of information for all of those big projects that I talked about a little bit earlier. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Alex.
All right, Brian, would you mind sharing, going back to the presentation for me?
Give me a second, sorry. There we go. Oh, I'm sorry. And Pastor Smith, before we go to Alex, I think there was a hand raised. I think Ms. Alford had her hand up. I don't know if she wanted to address before we switch over.
It might be a good idea to address if it's okay, Chair.
Yes, go right ahead, Ms. Alford.
On one of the slides, there was the mention of the 50,000 that was given to each school for use based on approval by the SAC. And I was just wondering, considering the current situation in our community with COVID, if there's any thought to having to potentially give immediate funds to each school based on a potential new learning environment with technology as well as social distancing. I know you probably can't fully answer that question, but I just wondered if there's been any thought to having to fund each school to comply with CDC guidelines.
Pastor Carl, I can answer that, or at least attempt to try to answer part of it. We have not talked about using any of the 50,000 funds because many schools have actually already encumbered those funds with some other project, the marquees, playgrounds, et cetera. anything involving COVID, whether it's the technology piece, whether it's social distancing, there's several other funding sources that we can use for that. We are anticipating some stimulus money that will be forthcoming in the near future, but also 1 mil funds could be used for technology if we need more of that in a particular setting. I was in fact on a call with superintendents today that really social distancing and returning to full school really don't mesh well together. That's just one of those things that may not be as easy to accomplish in a full return to school type environment. So for those funds, we haven't necessarily, we haven't done anything with those school-based funds. Those would come out of different funding sources if we have to do the technology or any like supplies, masks or gloves or PPE supplies that we would need for the schools, cleaning products we need for the schools, any extra like equipment we would need for deep cleaning. All of that we're covering from different funding sources, so the schools still have that money to do what they need in their buildings.
And just to clarify, I certainly wasn't advocating using any of the existing funds. I was basically looking at new funding sources.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay.
I'd like to interject one thing real quick. This is Suzanne Wynn again. I wanted to let you know that as we go through our design for Howard Bishop Middle School, for instance, we are moving to laptop technology. So for that school, when we do the redevelopment as part of our FF&E, we're purchasing 500 laptops to become more, to have the ability to become more flexible. So instead of having so many computers hooked to the wall, we're moving to laptop in those instances. I know it doesn't affect every school, but as we do the redevelopment projects and we touch every school, we are looking at that.
Okay, Alex, you want to continue?
Thank you, Chairman. So as this committee is obviously aware and the community as a whole, I think probably understands, we definitely decided in terms of our approach to this referendum. Well, let me take a step back actually. So there's kind of two ways in terms of funding the projects you can go. You can do a pay-as-you-go type method. Obviously, it's a much more protracted in terms of completion of projects. You essentially, for any of these projects, let's just pick Metcalf Elementary. We could, if we were going as a pay-as-you-go kind of model, that would be the only school we would do this year. We really felt it was important with the needs of our community. I don't want to say to make a splash, but really front load the referendum so we can make these changes now instead of waiting, 5 years down the road to really make any appreciable changes. So I did want to update the committee. I've mentioned, I think at least in our last two committee meetings that, we've been looking at financing the initial set of what we call the phase 1 projects. As you can see, these are the projects, the big four, which is what we call them, elementary school I, the redevelopments at Metcalf, Bishop, and Idlewild, and then the Oakview classroom building, and then the transition school that was necessitated by the demolition of Bishop for next year. And I will say, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but we kind of go through this process. These numbers are changing daily. I can tell you last week we got a good surprise in terms of our project costs with elementary school I. It's, in terms of the bonding process, and we'll kind of go through it a little bit in the next slide, but in terms of the process, there has to be like a stop date where like, this is what we're funding, or this is what we think the costs are going to be. But the good news is, as we mentioned earlier, if elementary school I comes in 3.1 million under budget, we can simply appropriate that to another project and advance another project on the schedule, which of course is really good news. So total project costs in terms of the bond were $110 million. And then on the next slide, we'll kind of go through the timelines a little bit. So as you can see, it was a very, very busy month, the last month for finance, and a lot of folks involved with this. Just in terms of the market, when we were looking at this in early March, there was a little bit of uncertainty with COVID-19 and the impacts, but that hadn't necessarily been represented in the municipal bond market. And, there were some very, very, very stressful days, like the day before spring break, or 2 days before spring break was a Thursday. We've been, looking at the municipal market every day, getting updates, because it's really important, the timing on this stuff, given the size of our bond. So we were looking at it, and, the whole time we'd really planned on doing a publicly offered bond instead of a direct placement. And one day on that Thursday, the market went up, MMD went up 50 basis points, which is a ton for that market. The day after that, it went up another 50. So it went up a whole full percent in the span of 2 days. And what we saw really was the market reacting to COVID-19. We did not have investors entering the market, just from a simple supply and demand kind of approach. If you've got supply with no demand, your prices are going up. So we saw a significant increase in the interest rate yields. So what we did was, obviously we want to keep and maintain our project schedule to make sure we have the funds available. So what we did was we got the board to authorize us to do either a publicly offered bond or a direct placement, depending on the market conditions. And we did put out an RFP for the direct placement, which would be just essentially a loan directly to a bank. And we did receive some pretty attractive rates. We felt like, in order to make our funds go further, we want to make sure we're making the best decision. If that means a little bit more work and some sleepless nights for me, that's what we're going to do. So on May 1st, we actually, Karen and I did a ratings presentation. So we brought in Moody's and Standard & Poor's and went through a really, really lengthy presentation. Of course, we talked about all the financial stuff, which what the rating agencies want to see, but we also went into a lot of detail on our district and the brag points that we have, the academics, the local economy, the stuff that if you're an investor in New York City, you probably don't know what Gainesville, maybe many of them have never even heard of Gainesville until you say UF and they're like, oh yeah, that's where the Gators play. So we went through a really lengthy process and did these presentations. And at the time, we were, right in the thick of really all the economic uncertainty and the ratings folks. We saw different ratings coming out. Broward County got downgraded in their bond rating, and a couple others did. We're actually able to maintain our rating, which is a huge success. We got our credit certified as high quality with a Moody's A3 and a S&P as an A+. So that was the first little bit of good news that we got. From there, we really kept our eye on the market. There was a couple districts that entered the market. So that's kind of what we were waiting on is, with these municipal deals, you don't necessarily want to be the first one out to test the market unless it's a slam dunk. So we had a couple districts in Palm Beach and Broward go out first. And then, at that point, with what we saw on the yields and the spreads, we felt really comfortable with going ahead and proceeding. Luckily, we had everything prepared. It was a ton of work, but we were ready to strike when the iron was hot. So on May 14th, we posted the POS. That's essentially a document that lets investors know about our rating, about our district, what we're looking for. And then on May 19th, we actually priced the bond out. So you could, it was actually a lot of fun. We could sit there and watch, Mutual of Omaha and some of the really, really big investors, B of A, and all these big investors actually purchase and invest in our district. The pricing went really well. I think we were like 2.6 times oversubscribed. And we'll look at the yields a little bit later, but we really, somehow managed to time it just right and got a really, really attractive rate for the district. And then we actually just closed last Thursday, I believe. So in terms of this bond, obviously it's a certificate of participation. We're going to be paying for it out of this the discretionary surtax, as we know. And we're going to be paying it for a 10-year period from July 1st, 2021 to 2030. We had plenty of coverage, and that's something that the investors look at is, are we leveraging our entire bond or our entire anticipated revenues? We were not. We had plenty of coverage. At the time, which of course has changed, we had a fund balance of 19.6 million. We've updated some of those figures, and we'll kind of go through that in the following slides. So when they actually post the bond, it's actually, they post it in blocks. So you can see the maturity date, and then the size of the principal amount. And the thought process there is, you've got different investors and different funds that need to rebalance, and they're they want to purchase the bonds at a specific point on the yield curve. So in order to make it a little bit more attractive and making sure we're, advertising a really good product, if you will, or financial instrument, we have all these separate maturities. And on the right, you can see the yields for each maturity. Obviously, the shorter the term, the less the interest rate risk and exposure. So you see lower yields. And then the longest maturity, obviously, there's more uncertainty, so those rates are higher. So I did want to give you an update of the 5 districts that went out, and you can see the dates within that 2-week period. I told you Palm Beach and Broward and Hillsborough also had a big refunding in Bay. But I did want to point out, in terms of our true interest costs, we came in actually much, much lower than all of them. Certainly very proud of that. I think it's, it was obviously a lot of hard work by staff, but in terms of our ability to make those half-cent dollars go further, I think, we did a fantastic job and timed the market just right. We were ready and prepared, and we're able to execute a deal that, in my opinion, will really change this district forever, and, at a very attractive rate. So in terms of our current debt issuances, you can see them there. The top 2, 10A, 10B, those are for Meadowbrook, and those interest rates were 5 and 4.5 respectively. Then we have a couple smaller issues, and you can see those are all in the upper 2s and 3s. So in terms of comparison, our Series 2020, which is this issue, was, I think, looks like about half of our lowest interest rate previously. So definitely, in terms of measuring this bond issue, I think we came in a really good place. So the $10,000 question is the impact of COVID-19. So what we've done is really thought through this as best we could. When you think about the timelines, and we've talked about this in the committee before, you have a serious delay, like a 2.5-month delay on when we receive the actual tax receipts for that month. So for example, for the March month collections, we just received that on the 20th, last Thursday or Friday. So there's a huge lag. So in terms of like projecting what we think we could be seeing in terms of revenue loss, what I did was I took, obviously the date certain for really when we really shut things down. It's about halfway or the last week of March. So that last week, you can't really extrapolate that, or the last month, you can't really extrapolate that much, because it doesn't really show you the true impact when we shut down for a full month. So what I did was I studied some reports, specifically the Moody's Analytic report. I'm not sure if any finance guys have looked through that. It's pretty terrifying, to be honest with you, but did give us a means for trying to project what we think we're going to see. I could tell you at the state level for the month of April, because they get their tax receipts in much like a month before us. What they saw at the state level for the month of April, which was like the first really month of the shutdown, was a 24% reduction. Want to be as conservative as we can with this stuff. You don't want to make adjustments, and then instead of a 24% reduction in April, we see a 35. So we want to be pretty conservative in terms of our projections of what we think we might be seeing. And I'm not an economist by any means. Brian, if you could go back one more. I'm not an economist by any means, but just to kind of follow it, March, we saw, either a quarter or the half of the month was really, we saw the decline. So we projected, a decrease that month, the following month for April, down to 35% reduction of revenues, and then, kind of stabilize a little bit in the summer, And then we're hoping and anticipating once we get to the fall, when the students, our students hopefully are back in brick and mortar, more importantly, the UF students are back in brick and mortar, we're going to start to see that those tax receipts start to come back up and then stabilize over the following months. So on this graph, what we did was we took the actual tax receipts, those are in green, and I took the tax receipts for that month the previous year and reduced them by the rates that were on the previous slide. So for April, we reduced them 35%. May, June, and July, I think it was 30%. And then just kind of following that graph out. And what is in red is the potential revenue shortfall for those collective months. So we're looking at, for the next year, potentially around $4.5 million reduction in revenues. That could be more, it could be less. Just in terms of projecting, we use the best data we had at the time, and looking at the Moody's analytic reports and other stuff like that that can give you a little bit of guidance on what we might be seeing. So I did want to take the committee through, and I'm not sure if you guys have all seen this, but when we started the sales tax initiative and a referendum, what we wanted to do, obviously, is come up with a really comprehensive project list. And we have two funding sources for capital needs, and that's the 1.5 millage levy, and then also the sales tax, which just passed. And projecting financials multi-years for people like me is a little bit nerve-wracking. And then when you look at a 12-year referendum, you got to be really, really careful what you're projecting 12 years out. So I just want to kind of walk you through the methodology and answer any questions you guys have about it. So basically, it goes year by year, and for the far left column, the estimated tax roll, we indexed or increased that by 4% a year. That's been our historical tax roll increase, I think, over the last 15 years on average. I can tell you the last 2 years, it's been well above that. But in terms of, doing a projection, again, we wanted to be very conservative with those figures. And the potential is we could see a reduction in those receipts, the property tax receipts. I can tell you our local tax base doesn't seem to be nearly as responsive to economic conditions is some of the, like specifically the coastal counties are the ones that really rely on a lot of tourism. We're pretty stable. We didn't, even during the Great Recession, we saw reductions, but they were very minor compared to some counties which saw 20-30% reduction in property values. So you basically take the tax roll and apply the millage rate of 1.5 mils. You can see the revenue. We do have debt service. Obviously, we're paying out of the 1.5 mil, and that's what we kind of summarized on the previous slides. And then the general fund transfer continued to reduce that, which gives you for the 12-year period an estimated revenues of 296 million. And then for the sales tax, and you got to keep in mind this is probably in 2018. We used the most current sales tax projections at that time, which were 23.4 million. We did not index those. A lot of districts do that. They'll assume for their project list, they'll assume, whatever it is, 1 to 2% increase in those tax receipts over the life of the referendum. The sales tax, as we're seeing, is a lot more responsive to economic conditions. So we wanted to be, again, very conservative with our approach in that, and not what we're trying to do is learn from our GO bond in the 1990s where we kind of overpromised and underdelivered. We want to have a little cushion. You can see total combined capital funds, 577 million. We did hold back 30% of the 1.5 mil funds, which is 88 million, to give us a little bit of cushion if we kind of deal with this situation we're dealing with right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. We know we're going to have our revenues and receipts decrease significantly. We don't know how much, we don't know how long, but we needed to put a cushion in there to give us some comfort. And I think, you know, obviously looking back on it was a very good decision, but we feel pretty good at this point, unless this becomes something, you know, even more significant than they're saying, and specifically the length of it becomes something we didn't anticipate. We should be okay with, based on these projections, with that 30% holdback. And then I should have mentioned this, but the total project budget, that's what we put on our facilities, our combined comprehensive facilities project list. So, you know, the 577, we held back 88. So we actually allocated in terms of project costs, 488 million.
And Pastor Smith, I believe we've gotten 2 new hands coming up. So before we go on to the next part, I don't know if you want to address those.
Would you bring them in, please?
Yeah, I
Brian?
saw Ms. Alford's hand up first, I think, and then I don't see the other hand now. Oh, Carrie Bush.
Karen, you had your hand up. Would you like to come in, please?
No, that must have been from a previous comment.
Oh, okay. Carrie Bush, I think, has a new hand up.
Yep.
Carrie, please come in. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I just wanted to try to distill the information from the last couple of slides we were shown on the actuals, kind of the percentage, the actuals, and then what's been held back. It is the takeaway from this that at this time, staff is not recommending any changes to the project plans because we have sufficiently held back funds of that previous mill. Is that the takeaway from those 3 slides?
Yeah, I would say, you know, we were prepared for something like this. And at this point, you know, we're still very, very early in on this, this COVID-19, and the economic impacts are largely unknown at this point. But we did prepare. And I think what I would say is there's no plan to significantly change the first phase of projects. So the ones that we put in the bond that are going to be, that we're going to be breaking ground on in the next month, that we're not changing the scope on those. But that, you know, when we start our second phase, based on what we saw in the previous 3 years, those discussions will be ongoing. And if we needed, you know, if we needed to reduce some of the scope on some of the projects, we'll certainly have time to do that. The other good piece is, you know, this is a 12-year referendum. There's a lot of time for recovery. We didn't build in, like I said, we didn't build in any trend on the sales tax. Again, I'm not an economist, but I think, you know, you should see a quicker turnaround with this than we would with a regular kind of recession, because there was no underlying financial crisis that created this. You know, it wasn't like, you know, the .com boom or the collapse of the real estate market. There's nothing underlying that really indicated in any way that we were going to see an end to the greatest bear market that this country's ever seen. It was just kind of unforeseen. So we're hoping we'll see a recovery. The other piece that I didn't mention that I should have is we didn't budget any kind of interest earnings. So over the, you know, the 12 years of the referendum, we obviously invest all of our receipts at obviously a very low yield, but it is still yield. And when you look at it for a 12-year period, we think we should be able to recoup some funds that way. And for example, from the beginning of the referendum to now, we've already collected, I think, over 150,000 just in interest. So we're hoping between the recovery and then, you know, the cushion we built in, but also that interest earning is really going to help us. And we're hoping, obviously, when we get to the end of the referendum, we'll hit our mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And then, Alex, that's why it's very important that we continue to post these estimates and be able to clearly look at, are we seeing any increases versus what our original plans are, et cetera. And the online tool, as one tool for doing that, needs to be kept as current as possible, because that's one place where the public eye is going. So I think it's critical that we keep those updated. There's also a couple of pages here about SPAC activity related to this property acquisition and the purchase timeline. That's pages, I guess, 30, 31 and beyond. I'm not certain if there's something specific that Paul and others wanted to lift out of this, or questions that we might have regarding items that just appear spooky to the observer. May not be spooky, but it certainly appears spooky.
Pastor Smith, I was going to do that, but seeing as it's already 5:25, I'm more than happy to just field questions. If there is anything about the timeline, part of, I think, in looking back, realizing that this goes back more than 2 years, this property purchase really kind of started when we put the School Planning Advisory Committee together. I think the letter to the cities went out in January of 2018. And that was, we had approval to build an elementary school. Where was that elementary school going to be? Part of our interlocal agreement with all the cities in the county is that before we build a new school, close a school, or significantly change the capacity at an existing school, we need to convene this committee, and it's a representative from each of the cities in the county and community members that they select as well. And so that process went for about 8 months. Where is the new elementary school going to be? It was during that process that this Sanders property that we just wound up buying was identified. And so it's almost like it's a 2-year history, and you probably don't need me to go through it line by line. But I'm more than happy to answer questions, because I helped the SPAC go. We've got at least 2 SPAC members, I think, on the Oversight Committee who can probably remember those days as well. And then the timeline with the real estate process is there as well. So I'll stop talking and I'll answer questions rather than go through date by date.
So I'm opening up the floor to discussions regarding this purchase timeline and related questions for any members of the committee who'd like to raise any at this time.
Chair, I have a question.
Okay, Karen.
So I guess my question is, Brian, why the rush on this? It was reiterated in the minutes on March the 3rd about the need to be transparent, and that was emphasized. Speaking exactly from the minutes, it said members stressed the importance of being transparent. So I'm just still curious, because it hasn't been answered in my mind, why this did not come up during the March meeting or previous meetings, and what was the rush?
So I mean, I can't answer completely. I actually would say that in my view, this is almost the exact opposite of a rush, since this property was first kind of identified in mid 2018. The appraisals were obtained in, I believe it's October and November of 2019. There was a workshop before the board in early February that kind of gave a green light to staff to start negotiating. The back and forth of offer and counter offer took 3 weeks. And I mean, some of this is just going to be, I think, our usual practice with the 1 mil, and other is going to be the kind of the need to not have public negotiations. It's kind of as an example, the school board does not get to meet in private with no cameras, no notes, unless it's for collective bargaining or for security issues. And that specific security issues, like where is the camera going to be placed, where, things like that. And for collective bargaining purposes, it's for the kind of the obvious idea, if the board says, we'd like you to offer 2 million in raises, but if they won't take anything less than 3 million, you have our approval. Well, if that's all done in the public, we can't offer 2 million. We have to just start at 3, because it's already known what our upper limit is. Similar to property purchases, if we announce publicly that we want to buy this particular piece of land, if anyone else is looking at it, they know to get going, and we might have competition for it. if we publicly discuss what the appraisals have come at and the board votes to say, well, let's offer this amount, but if they say, no, you can go this high, well, the owner's not going to sell to us for anything other, assuming they would still sell, for anything less than what we've already gotten public approval of. And so that's why it's very hard to do land acquisition in the public, and the system is set up so that we do all of this kind of behind the scenes, and then there's a 30-day window where we have to advertise it, and it goes to the board for approval or disapproval after all of that has taken place. Now, I think as we get to a slide, I'm sorry, I'll fit ahead. One of the things that we think we can do is a little bit earlier on, like on March 30th, for example, the superintendent sent an email to all the board members that we had a final contract ready to go and ready to advertise. There's no reason why that couldn't have been shared with you at that same time. So you would have had 5 weeks to look at it before the board vote. You know, that at that point, once we have an option contract, the public records exceptions go away. And that's so that the public and everyone can look at it. And so that is one of the things that I think we have a looking forward slide coming up, where we realized that there's no reason why you can't know that early. You know, it's hard to envision it, and it would probably fall on me to rewrite your I forget what we call them, goals and responsibilities. And I'm probably the one that wrote the one that you're up under now. I pretty much copied and pasted what we did with the 1 mil oversight. And so I don't want to prompt your discussion for the next part, but you know, trying to figure out where you could fit in to the process before kind of decisions are made. I mean, like if there's a sudden need to replace a roof at a school, convening you all to get approval, I mean, like that could create enormous delays. So I kind of be worried about that, but I do see that a land acquisition that was contemplated from the beginning, because we didn't know where the new school was going to be. And the committee actually recommended this property as the best place to put it. So land acquisition, had the board approved, had we had the option in November of 2018 or December of 2018, when the board ultimately selected Oakmont, if this property had still been available, the board might have actually voted to go pursue this property and then build the school there. And so land acquisition would have been necessary in order to build the new school. But Brian, that's a lot of talk. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
may I say one? So number one, I personally cannot make this point clear enough. If this property was identified in 2018 and per your own timeline was re-identified in July of 19, that it perhaps is back up on the marketplace. And if you shared in February in a public setting with the school board that you were in negotiations over it, we're not asking to be at the negotiation table. We're asking to be informed. And this is not a $3.6 million roof we're talking about. So I do push back on the assertion that we will somehow be hindering the process of improving our schools by being involved. This process was unacceptable to what we sold to voters. And I have a major problem with what I just heard in terms of some kind of argument that it would have been unreasonable or somehow impacted the school's position to negotiate by simply mentioning that this is under consideration. And since I'm now rolling, let me also say that having been contacted by people that we convinced to support this, they were welcome and very upfront with perhaps the price we paid and the appraisals we obtained are not terribly representative of what's going on in the marketplace. 60-something acre zone commercial right behind Publix in Jonesville just sold for about $70,000 an acre. We're paying about 98. There are housing developments being built along Parker Road that are going for 30 to 35,000 an acre. We're paying 98. And so while it's really easy for me to sit here and quarterback on a decision that's already been made, I'm doing so because I wasn't invited to participate at all in the months leading up to this. And I just want to make that point very clear.
Thank you, Brian. And Brian, if you'll walk through the timeline, and Brian has already done that, but Brian Moore, if you'd walk through the timeline, it suggests ample opportunity, and it suggests that where there are some spooky points, we could have had a chance to discuss the spooky points without getting here. So I'm looking at page 31, and this timeline is and the activities associated is very interesting to me, beginning in November of 2018. So Brian, just in an overview kind of way, does this timeline speak to what's really transpired, and yet we didn't pause for input?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, again, and maybe this is just our lack of purchasing property. We haven't done it since Diamond Sports. And I'm thinking about the interlocal agreement and our requirement to work through the SPAC committee and their recommendation of, property and the role that they play. And so there's the part of me that is, has told board members at meetings, no, we can't specifically name the property. We can tell you generally where it is. I believe the day after that, November 12th, 2018 was the final SPAC committee report to the board, a workshop. And even then we were circumspect in directly identifying in public. And at that point, it was off the market. It wasn't really even on our top of our mind. It just had been the number one 2 months earlier before it had been purchased. But what struck us, I think, and I don't know if it struck Mr. Mason or Mr. McNeil as well. I don't want to speak for SPAC because I was there not as a voter, but as a kind of a facilitator. But in going through every single parcel in the county and seeing just how few places there were that were appropriate for schools, and Mr. Scarborough mentioned the area, the property right behind Publix. That was the first one that jumped into my mind because I knew I'd seen the sign for sale driving by it. And I don't remember why that got eliminated in the SPAC process. It did at some point. It might have been a wetlands issue in terms of how much of the property contained wetlands, because it's bigger. It's like 60 or 70 acres. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. But
yeah, I'm trying to get you, Brian, to look at the timeline.
Right.
And it says some things happen on 11/12/18.
Right.
Then
request for qualifications. Yeah.
Right. Then it gives us a ranking on 1/14/19 that magically changed on 6/18/19. That's spooky to me.
Well, it's not magical. What happened is that right there at the beginning of March, the Bossart team that had initially submitted their, for lack of a better word, resume, their credentials, their qualifications, they left Bossart to join another company. And so between April and May, or really March, April, and May, it was, well, wait, what do we do now? Who are we talking to? And so Bossart was asked to update their resume, update their credentials, because they're the team that had done, it's Team Riles that had made their Bossart's pitch was no longer there. And then, it was that team that had really, I guess, impressed the facility staff the most. So it was decided to just open it up again and reconsider all three. And that was done in June after the team looked again at the credentials of all three companies.
So Brian, can I just ask a question because it says re-ranking? Are you saying the facility staff did the re-ranking on that?
Yes, the same 5 that had done it originally in January. I believe it, I'm working memory here. Paul White, Suzanne Wynn, Tom Cowart, Teresa Sperling Wood, the 3 directors and the assistant superintendent, and I believe Horace Freeman, another facilities staff member, were the 5 that assessed the credentials. And I guess another kind of point to make is this is a request for qualifications. 8 years in working here, I still haven't learned all the different education acronyms we have, and they get really confusing. So we've already heard Suzanne earlier mentioned, and I wrote it down because I didn't know what it was, an FF&E. And then Alex mentioned the RFP, and this is an RFQ, but there's more than one RFQ. There's a request for qualifications, there's a request for a quote. But this is essentially, instead of just opening the phone book and hiring a professional commercial real estate agent, we asked them to submit their resumes, their qualifications. And so it's a little bit different than a full-fledged request for proposals, a bid, anything like that. We just needed a professional to help us because we had ranked the Sanders property #1 and then had it sold while the SPAC committee was meeting it. A couple of years ago, I think Mr. White had realized that there was a property that was going up for auction right next to East Side, but we were only 3 days from auction. Well, how does a school board purchase property at auction? How does it get, or you can't go to an auction and say contingent upon later board approval, but maybe if we'd had a realtor to help us or be aware of it earlier, we might have been able to come up with something. Similarly, and I think the biggest issue was staring at that building right next to GHS, knowing the extent of the project at Gainesville High. What are we going to do with those kids? What is happening with that property that's been abandoned and kind of torn down for the last 5 years? It goes in fits and spurts. Who owns it? Might they be willing to sell it? And we really, we don't have a realtor on staff. Let's get one and see what we can do to try and look into what's there and what sort of possibilities we'd have. So, I see people have unmuted, so I'm going to stop.
Mr. Chair, I was just going to suggest we jump to the moving forward slide because I want to talk about getting better.
Fair enough. Let's go. Let's go. Moving forward.
And so one suggestion that I think's worth considering is adjusting our meeting frequency to every other month instead of quarterly, just so we can stay better abreast of what's going on. I would also ask staff if we could please have presentations like this a week in advance so that we could do our homework and draw our lines and make our comparisons to notes we've had in the past, so that we can begin each meeting with a series of committee-driven questions rather than sitting back and listening to presentations. I think that would be useful.
So meeting frequency recommendation is to go to a 2 month versus a quarterly schedule. There was also a request made to see if we could move the meeting to the second Monday of each month rather than the first Monday because there's a conflict with the Children's Trust Board meeting and the like. So if we could kind of put those two things together. Committee members, are we comfortable with the meeting frequency change and moving it a week from the first Monday of the month to the second Monday of each month, of each second Monday in the months that we're meeting? Are we comfortable with that, team?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and possibly maybe consideration for a virtual meeting if everyone can't meet physically in between.
The other thing that regarding getting better and these decisions is, and I said this to the superintendent, if you need to have a call meeting, let us call a meeting. I want to go on record as saying the lack of transparency and being informed is very uncomfortable when you've been entrusted by the community to serve on their behalf. So whatever we need to do to bridge that gap, let's insist that we do that as we're making these changes. And then let's continue on moving forward. We've talked about that.
Mr. Chair, I did have one question of clarification. Now that the land will be closed on, is there an intent to slide a new school onto this land in the next 10, 12 years under this half-cent funding?
I'll answer that, Mr. Chair. There is no intent for that at this moment. Where that came from was in our looking at projections from the state and where we're going to be, that there's a documented projection, for lack of a better word, that almost seems like an oxymoron, but a documented projection looking at a 7 to 10 year that we may be in need of a new school. And so that's what had prompted that piece, because many districts have been buying up property. I'm not saying, nor am I suggesting that we do that, but many districts do that. So they have property available. So when it comes time to build a new school, they're not out looking for property at that time. Like, they have it ready to go and then they move forward with the school. So at the end of the day, if there was a new school that's needed in year 9, let's say, obviously that would have to be brought back and make those decisions. Do we have the need for it? And B, is it an elementary school, or is it a middle school, or is it a high school? I mean, obviously a lot can change in that time period. And especially with any capacity changes we make with projects, like the additional wing at Oakview Middle School. If we weren't doing that, it might be the middle school is needed. So no, right now there is no plan to build a school in year whatever of the sales tax. That's not the case at all. But potentially those, if we got to that point and enrollments increased to that point, we would need to have those discussions.
That's fair. Madam Superintendent, do we anticipate any litigation based on these actions? I was informed that there are people considering a lawsuit based on how this transpired. So are you aware of any anticipated litigation because folks don't feel that this was a fair process?
I have not been informed of that. No, I'm not aware of any of that.
Okay, that's fair.
Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
So with that being said, I don't know, this is a real unrest with me, because I feel like there's been a violation of the intent of the ballot language. I do not believe a large majority of citizens are happy about this purchase. So my question would be, is there any recourse? First of all, are there any pause points that will allow us to review this process, to stop where we are and take another look? Just what are our options at this point?
District staff?
I can answer that. I think the only thing we were waiting for, and I don't know if it happened at noon, but we were waiting for FedEx to submit signatures back from South Florida, where one of the owners or somebody who had the sign was. So it is entirely possible that we own it right now. It was just a matter of getting the last signatures done, which everything now, I guess, with closings is done with virtual and distance. So I've not had a chance to talk to our real estate attorney this afternoon, but my understanding was that was the last step that was needed.
Okay, and with that being said, then I think I looked at some language about audit. Do we have some obligation to audit certain transactions under the half cent? Is there any plan to do an annual audit of the process?
We were audited by the state prior to being able to put the language on the ballot. They came down and audited our facilities department, its policies and procedures and processes. I think that all of our expenditures, and Mr. Rella hopefully can jump back in with this, all of our expenditures are audited every year by every 2 out of every 3 years, I believe. Alex, you take over before I get it wrong.
Sure. Thank you for stopping there. Yeah, we get audited quite a lot. I think any given year we could see between 5 and 7 audits, from arranging subject areas such as FRS, and federal programs and stuff like that. Our financials are audited and certified every single year. Every 3 years, as Brian alluded to, we're audited by the Auditor General's office. So they'll send a staff down. It's been set up shop for about 8 months and go through with a fine tooth comb all of our financials. They look for a lot of operational issues, if there's any kind of cash controls, or they flip every single rock that we have. I know a lot of other agencies like cities don't really have that kind of oversight, but we are audited significantly. They obviously are going to look very closely at all of our sales tax purchases to make sure they're within the referendum. Obviously, the huge piece of the function of this group is to, again, make sure we're making purchases that are within the referendum language. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we get, I tell you what, we get an awful lot of audits.
Yeah, it was not such a general question. It was more or less to this transaction. Is there potential for this to come up in an audit? And was the purchase made within the intent of the ballot language?
To that end, I mean, I would say it was, obviously let me say this. What the auditors are going to do is look at our referendum language first and foremost. I mean, every district has a different list of things they put in. Some schools, some district put on school buses and stuff like that. So what they're going to do is pull our approved referendum language and make sure all the purchases lie within those parameters. So for this one, obviously land was on the referendum language, so there wouldn't be any audit issues. In terms of what Brian was talking about earlier, when we selected the services for the Realtor, I mean, we have a lot of requirements that go into procurement. Professional services such as real estate services or attorney services, they aren't necessarily subject to any kind of process in terms of what we have to do, like a statutorily defined, like RFP process or request for proposal, where there's a team that does the analysis, they collect all the proposals and rank and score everyone. So for the realtor services, we didn't really have to do, technically per the law, do any kind of solicitation. We could, as Brian mentioned, just go straight to the phone book and grab a name. We thought, since we have not secured these services in the past, we felt it was really important to do our due diligence. So we did do that due diligence. And since it's not necessarily paid by the district, they're not really subject to, but we wanted to make sure we do that. The point of mentioning that is it's not necessarily an audit issue from that perspective.
Okay.
We have a couple of hands. Karen and Ann Carey have been trying to get in. Karen, you want to come on in now? Karen McCann.
Okay, I just unmuted.
Okay.
Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
Yeah, thanks. I really do appreciate the comments. Listening to this has made me more aware that there are people on this committee that have put their reputation on the line and really went all out to make sure that this has passed and that it went through, that the ballot language went through. And for those people, I especially feel that the comments made about us maybe needing to meet more often and to know what's ahead of us instead of finding out at the last minute are really good points. So I do agree with Brian's suggestion that we do try to meet more often, so that, because I didn't know anything about the land purchase that's being considered for GS either. But I would like to make some comments to sort of, while everything is going on and everything has been going on, we have COVID-19 that we're dealing with. And I want to say that working in a capacity with the school board for 8 years and being union president, I see when chaos occurs, how it how other things can get overlooked and how you're working so hard from day to day just to try to solve daily problems that are coming up, not knowing if schools are going to reopen and dealing with the situation on a day-to-day basis. So I do want to say that I do feel for the people at the district who are trying to deal with all of this, and for the board that's trying to deal with all of this. And perhaps not only do we have the COVID-19 situation, but we also have going on in our country right now, Black lives and our Black community who feel disenfranchised, and the controversy over East and West, which is terrible, and perceptions that are out there. So I think this did come at a bad time. Whether it was not available at a different time to purchase, and so it wasn't done earlier, I just feel that the timing hasn't been good. And in looking at all of the things that are taking place that are positive throughout the district with the improvements being made, my suggestion would be that we need to do a better job, or I would say the district, of public relations. And that is nothing to say about the job that Jackie Johnson does, because I know she's great. She works extremely hard. But I would like to make a suggestion that the district try to look at some ways to, other than website, that people just don't go on. Many people may not even know that that's available to go on, but having TV and having the newspapers and having other media being able to show what's happening throughout the district, all the positive things that the money is being spent for, would be a really good thing for the public. And so that's just a suggestion that I'm going to make. And my other concern now, and finally, is that we have the 1 mil ballot language coming up in 2020. And if we can't get this fixed, so to speak, or we can't get a little bit more positive PR going about how this money is being spent, it really may do damage to the 1 mil. And that's a big concern of mine. And I just wanted to share some of those feelings.
Thank you very much, Karen. Carrie Bush, I'm going to go to you, and then we're going to try to wrap up, being sensitive to everyone's time.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. So I just wanted to put out for the committee's consideration to float an idea. I feel like we've spent 2 hours on this topic and it's still relatively opaque to me. And what I would like, knowing that committees of this nature often have a fiduciary role in providing oversight, I don't feel comfortable to either endorse or not endorse, and I don't know that that's what we should be doing, but I feel like it might be important after a 2 hour long conversation to have some statement from the committee about what the sentiment is collectively. And so, Mr. Chair, if I may, I would, try and craft some language if you would like to entertain that. But what I don't want to see is just leaving the conversation as it is, because I don't think that there's clarity, and the committee's position, I don't think, has been articulated.
Thank you very much for that. And yes, I would value you doing so, and then we would share it with the committee for feedback and the like. I think it is important. There are some closing things, team, that I think we want to do. One is we want Karen and her staff to clearly hear this oversight committee's call for transparency. We want to be in it with you. We want to be able to help along the way. And we want to be the voice that'll give you a perspective to consider when you're making the decision, because we don't have the authority to make decisions. So transparency is important. And number two, the proper engagement of the committee in whatever ways that may be, so that we're involved on the front end and not after the fact. And then my third request is for the school board to value this committee even the more. And before these decisions are made, just ask the question, has the Oversight Committee had an opportunity to tune in one way or the other? I think we have to honor the process and hear us and consider our voice while you ultimately are the ones that make the decision. And to me, it says communicate, communicate, communicate. We are better together, and we have to make certain that we value the roles that each of us have been asked to play as we work toward having a world-class education system here for Alachua County Schools. Based on the discussion of the group, I'm recommending the next meeting via Zoom 2 months from today, which would be Monday, 2 months, and the second Monday, which would be Monday, August the 10th. If we go 2 months from this meeting, and then the second Monday, based on the request, be August the 10th, you will get a meeting package at least 1 week in advance to include the agenda that we will try to lead with input from staff, and we will all work together to make things better. I'm going to close now. Thank all of you very much.
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, we've had 3 people that have put in the chat that they'd like to speak, and I didn't get a chance to tell you about it, so I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead. I see Brian, I see Dean, and I see Jason.
Yes.
Okay. Just to echo your comments, I mean, we're here as a resource, and I hope nobody on this call took my comments as being negative. If, as Karen said, if anything, I'm just feel very passionate that this go very well. And I think that we need to focus on what is going well. And I have no doubt that, 15 years from now, when this is all said and done, this will be reflected upon as a transformative initiative for this community. So we just want to make sure that we're here as a resource and are reflected or looked on as that from staff and the board. And with regard to our next meeting, I do want to make sure on our agenda is the discussion of governance. We are all set to be done in December with our service. So we need to be talking about what the go forward looks like. So I'd like to talk about that at the next meeting. And lastly, because it was sent out in our packet, I know that the board is meeting Wednesday, and on the agenda is the subject of impact fees. I would just say to staff and the board, given that we are in the midst of this kind of a controversy with this purchase, and we do have the 1 mil coming up this year, I hope the board thinks really long and hard about the timing of discussing an additional revenue source.
Dean, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, again, want to echo a lot of what we've said in this meeting. That really is important, not for us just to say and get off our chest, but in order to take some action on it. But for, whether it's the Westwood Howard Bishop decision or the land acquisition decision, for members of this committee to find out about these things through the newspaper as opposed to active participation or being informed or in any way a part of the process prior to multi-million-dollar decisions being made, and for us to read about it in the newspaper, and for our friends and family and people throughout the community who depend on us to take a look at these things and to make sure this money is being spent in a fair and intelligent way. Again, it really digs me, and it gets me not in just saying, okay, I'm going to get it off my chest and everybody's going to move on down the road and no change is made. I don't think that's appropriate. I mean, I listen to Brian. I think meeting more commonly is important, but if we meet more commonly and simply are more commonly left out by virtue of being in meetings more often of multi-million-dollar decisions until after they've been rendered, I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that's helpful. I think that we're meeting more commonly, not necessarily taking any direct role or action. And I can tell you, I did not join this subcommittee, this oversight committee, in order to simply be a front row historian on decisions that have already been made. The goal here is, if you look around the members of this group, this is a very, very strong group of folks who have a very diverse set of skills and experiences and thoughts. And there's a reason that the folks in this group were chosen to be a part of this group. And it's not simply so that they could rubber stamp things that have already happened in the past. That's something we need to think about. It's something, for example, in reports, when reports are given with respect to budgets. Brian brought up earlier, one number, I believe it was in Newberry, was about 50% higher than a prior projection. When numbers come out, when we get the current budgets, they should show what the current expectation is, what the latest, most recent, and greatest data is, and compare that to the prior information that we were last given, so that we don't have to go in and look through months old data on our own and say, okay, how does this change? What's the difference? Were the prior projections accurate? These are things that allow us to make sure that things are moving along smoothly in a business. They're the way things are presented so that we can see the change. We can reflect on whether prior projections were accurate. We can reflect on whether or not we're moving in the proper direction. That's important, but I can tell you, the land acquisition really hits me hard. Multi-million dollar decision. It is, for example, when a businessman goes out and evaluates a purchase, they don't buy in anticipation that 10 or 15 years from now, there could be value in a property. Because instead of tying up $3 or $4 or $5 million, what they could do instead is go out and put an option contract on a piece of property and pay a certain amount of money for the right to purchase that property in the future. Maybe it's $50,000 a year, $25,000 a year, and you could renew it annually. 4 years from now, our needs could be very different from the time that option was issued. You could choose to exercise that option or not exercise that option, but ultimately millions of dollars of less of capital was tied up during that time. I've seen this done with due diligence, very protracted due diligence periods, including a contract I'm negotiating right now where it's a multi-year due diligence period. And there are certain milestones and hard money tied up, but that hard money may be $25,000 or $50,000 rather than multi-million dollars. So the thought there is, again, consider how, if we were to have another 2008, how this would look in 2023. If all of a sudden land values are cut in half and we realize that we paid double for a piece of property than we could have, if we had tied up maybe $50,000 as opposed to several $1 million, it's a lot more responsible with respect to the taxpayers' money, with respect to the issues that we were given to solve in this county. And those are the kinds of good and thoughtful decisions that are made when you involve all of the people in the decision-making process who were intended to be a part of that process. And again, I firmly reject the notion that no property could be negotiated on without, when you brought in all of these different people, because it would taint the negotiations. That's not accurate. You can speak in broad strokes. You can have sidebars with folks who are involved. These are things that can be done in the sunshine and can be done with a large degree of discretion. So I say that in hopes that we will make changes, and in hopes that, moving forward, this is done in a much more thoughtful manner, because for us to read about something after the fact in the paper as a part of the Oversight Committee, there are a lot of folks here who have their reputations on the line. There are a lot of folks who care very deeply here. We're not trying to pad our resumes by showing up to these meetings. We want to make effective progress. We want to be better in this community. We want to help the school system. That's why we're devoting our time to this. So let us do exactly that.
Thank you very much, Dean, and we share your sentiments. There's one other person out here for comments. Please come at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think the consensus is, and that our general feeling about the land transaction has been that it has done significant damage to the transparency and trust of the committee with staff. It's not irreparable, but it's something that we need to work on. And I think if this committee, if we don't make the changes that we're talking about, changing the frequency of our meetings and the scope of the information that we get, and the direction that we take this committee, just like Dean said, none of us are here to be a rubber stamp. None of us are here for that. But if we don't repair this transparency and trust issue now, it is going to present issues with renewal of the 1 mil. Or if we don't get to address all of our issues with this half cent, if we wanted to do another half cent in the future, it really puts it into peril, because the public is not going to trust it like it did with the formation of this committee in the first place. So I don't think the problems that we have are irreparable, but if we don't get it turned around quick, it will do lasting damage to the facilities of the school board in the future, long into the future. Excuse me. And I think Carrie has put up in the chat an excellent statement that I think that's the direction that the committee ought to go, so that we can positive steps toward repairing these transparency and trust.
Very good. And again, thank all of you. I think that's where we've got to be better from this. We can't do more of the same. We've got to continue to ask ourselves, how do we bring value to this process and use it in a way that it allows us to gain the support of the community, because they view us as a credible source for doing what's best for all. It is 6:08. Thanks to all of you. Carrie, I look forward to looking at your draft, getting your final document, and us getting that published. Thank all of you again.
Pastor
Carrie,
Carl,
yes?
could I have 10 seconds? I know
Yes, ma'am.
everybody's ready for dinner. Thank you all, everyone, for the input. If you could see my notebook, I took lots of good notes today, which I do on everything. We hear you. I hear you. My staff, there's a lot that are still here on the screen that I can see. I hear you. And as I said at the beginning, we have to get better. I will own this as the leader of this system, that we have to get better. On that slide, there are a couple of things that as staff, we talked about of how to get that information to you sooner. And I would even take it a step further, that the general public doesn't necessarily discriminate between half cent versus capital versus other funding sources, right? All they see are things being built or things being done. And so anytime there's a facilities project, I want to make sure that that information goes to the half cent committee, because at the end of the day, it may not come to you as a expenditure by any means. You know, a new roof at a particular school may not be coming out of half cent. But if a constituent has a question about that and it happens to be your child's school or your neighbor's school, I feel like you need to have that information as well. So basically you're seeing all of the facilities projects. Then we can dig deeper into, you know, how those projects are funded, and if they're split funded, which a lot of them may be at the end. I want to make sure that we have that information to you as well in a timely fashion, but also making sure that with projects, you know, because they're going to be varying scopes. Part of what I've asked staff to do, and I don't think I spelled it out well enough in that slide, is yes, we have those major projects going on right now, but what's coming? And I think Jackie mentioned, we talked about the Oakview classroom building, but there's other things that are starting as well. And so I think there's a little snippet of that in the presentation. But that's what I want to make sure we do at every meeting, that, you know, as we've said, a lot of folks don't see that things are happening until dirt's moving, but there is work that would potentially be going on. And so I want to make sure that you are updated on what's in the hopper moving forward. Because just because we finish in fall of 21 with all these big projects doesn't mean that the team isn't already starting to make plans for other projects as well. So moving forward, I want to make sure that you have all that information. And of course, if there's ever questions as we send that to you, I mean, feel free to reach out to me or any of my staff that we can answer those questions for you. But I want to make sure that anytime we have board workshops, board meetings, anything that involves facilities projects, that you all are aware of that. So even if it's not your necessarily meeting, if the board's going to have a workshop on it, that you would be aware of that as well. So if you wanted to listen in or come to the meeting once we get back to in-person meetings, I want to make sure that you have that. And again, I've addressed some of these things with staff already. And we will make some improvements on our internal processes going forward as well, because we want to make sure that we do earn back your trust. And as I said at the beginning, I know that's, you know, it takes a long time to build up and really quick to lose. But we want to make sure that we do that because I don't believe there was any ill will on any part of any staff member or anything like that with all of this. But we have to do a better job at communication. And so like I said, we've already made some changes internally. We'll continue to review those processes so that you guys are more than kept up to date. In fact, I dare use the word over communicate with you on everything moving forward.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to sign off now, team. Thank you much. You'll be hearing more from us in the days to come. Thank you.